Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Josh McCullough. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, COVID-19 Regulatory Updates and FAQ. We're going to get started right now. We're at the top of the hour. We have a full hour of information ready for you, and I will be introducing our presenter here in just a second. Before we get started, I do want to go over some housekeeping items. We will be providing the recording and the slides to this webinar. Give us about 24 hours on that, but we will be emailing you links to both the recording and the slides. As far as questions today, we are going to have a fairly large audience with us today. We do encourage your questions. We will try to pick off a few of those and address those. We also anticipate from experience that many of your questions do eventually get resolved within the content of the webinar. But if you are going to ask questions, which we encourage, please use the Q&A box. There is a Q&A box and there is a chat box. And the Q&A box will ensure that the presenters and myself have the best visibility to your questions, and we do want to be aware of those as we move through today's presentation. We are going to do a couple of polls here in probably 10 minutes or so as a quick break. We'll take a minute or two for those. We know you multitask in these events. That's great. I do the same thing myself, but when we do those polls, would love it if you'd hop back over to the webinar window and cast your vote on those polls. We will share that info, and the polls are designed to bring some insight and information to you that you might find helpful. So that is those are the housekeeping items I wanted to cover. With that, I will introduce today's presenter. We have Kira Govra with us. She is an attorney, compliance expert, has been keeping up on all things COVID-19, and she has got a lot of information for you today, and she'll go through the agenda here right off the bat. So Kira, welcome and take it away.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. It is nice to be here with you again, possibly for the second time. If you came to this presentation a couple of weeks ago, I want to let you know that there's a fair bit of overlap still because some things simply haven't changed all that much, but the section in the middle on the FFCRA has been expanded quite a bit now that we have more guidance from the DOL and the IRS. And I still won't really be talking in any depth about other legislation such as the CARES Act. So if you're interested in like the payroll protection program, I don't have any info on that. So I just don't want anybody to hang on till the last minute hoping I'll cover something I won't. But we do hope that there will be useful information elsewhere in the webinar for you. All right, so first up, let's talk about keeping the workplace safe. This is some of the CDC's current guidance. It's clearly not all of it. Some of it are also just ideas. So if you haven't looked at the CDC's interim guidance for businesses and employers yet, I would encourage you to. If you just Google that phrase, it'll be the top hit. It's put out by the CDC. It's got some good specific guidance, as well as like what to do specifically if someone in your workplace is diagnosed and how to clean and stuff like that. And then it's got some overall like big picture guidance as well. So I think that's a really good item to review. As far as sort of practical matters, when employees come in the morning, have them wash their hands, wash off whatever it is that they were touching before they got there, and schedule regular hand washing as well. So have everybody get up from their desk once an hour or, you know, however often makes sense from you, in your workplace. Also schedule disinfecting of frequently touched surfaces. So I know cleaning products are pretty hard to find right now. I would encourage you to look at COVID List N. If you search for that, it'll pop right up. It's put out by the EPA. It's a very long list of cleaning products that will kill this virus. And includes some interesting things that you might have around the house, like, pet stain and odor remover. There's, a couple brands that are on the list that are specifically for that. So you might discover that you do, in fact, have some of those cleaning products. Now that we're acknowledging that this can be airborne as well, the CDC is recommending increasing ventilation with outside air. So don't just randomly crank up the AC. If it's recycling air, that probably won't help at all. But if you can open a door, open windows, or if your AC pulls in from the outside air, that could help as well. You do want to mandate physical distancing of 6 feet. So in certain circumstances, this may not be possible, but most workplaces can do something to make this happen. And that will include just sort of walking around as the boss and telling people to create more space between one another. It's the sort of awkward thing to enforce, but I think it is really important right now and will probably make your employees feel safer as well. To that same end, if you are open to the public and you have customers, stagger their flow, put tape on the floor so they know how far apart 6 feet is when they're standing in line. Use online transactions if you can. So if there are things you can sell online or do online or book online, any of that, that's a great thing to look into right now while we all have some downtime. Well, we don't all have downtime, but some of us have downtime. If you're open to the public, again, remove tables, remove chairs, put tape on the floor, do what you can to create that 6 feet of distance. And then finally, if you don't have tap and pay yet, like you just haven't set it up, but you've got the technology for it, that might be something you want to look into. So that's like, Apple Pay, where somebody taps their phone on the little checkout machine and it pays automatically. Touching pin pads is my least favorite thing in the world right now, especially since I don't have all that much hand sanitizer left in the car. So do what you can to reduce the amount of things that multiple people have to touch. What about taking employees' temperatures or asking about symptoms when they come in the morning? This would generally be a big fat no. Taking a temperature is considered a medical exam. We wouldn't want to do that, but under the circumstances, because COVID is considered a direct threat in the workplace, we can do this. However, some things to keep in mind. If you are going to ask questions about symptoms, we want to make sure they're specific to COVID-19. Don't ask open-ended questions. That can get us into disability inquiry territory, and we don't want to be there. If you're taking temperatures, those are private health information and need to be kept confidential. So no announcing the number out loud when you've got a line of employees waiting to have their temperature taken. Also, beware of creating more risk than you're preventing, and this can happen a couple of ways. One way is you've got somebody handling the temperature-taking device or possibly passing it around. I don't know that the thermometer or forehead thermometers are all that easy to find right now, so you might be using something else. So whatever that something else is, make sure that, if it is being passed around, that it's being disinfected appropriately. Preferably, if we're finding a way to do this without passing something around. Another way we can create risk by doing this is by assuming that our employees who are, not showing a fever and not showing any symptoms are safe and free of the virus. And that is just very unwise to assume. We don't want to cut back on any of our other safety measures just because we sort of checked everybody at the door. Most people incubate this on average 5 days and can certainly pass it around before symptoms are showing. So we should continue to behave as if everyone has COVID-19 right now. What about sick employees? Can we send them home? Yes, you can, and you should. You have always been able to send sick employees home, assuming they're sick with something that seems contagious. So if somebody comes to the office and they seem to have a common cold, you are able to send that person home. Employees don't have any sort of fundamental right to be at work on any given day, unless, of course, they're subject to like a collective bargaining agreement or some other kind of contract. For the most part, though, you as the employer have the right to send people home pretty much whenever you feel like it, so long as it's not for a discriminatory reason. So particularly in a COVID-19 situation, under a global pandemic, anybody who's sick should probably be sent home. I wanted to give you sort of a ballpark on when people can come back if they have been sick. You shouldn't try to sort of like force this on individual employees. They should talk to their healthcare provider, but I just wanted you to have a sense of this. So if somebody's sick, they don't need to go home and stay there for 14 days. They need to stay for either, probably a full week or 72 hours after their symptoms have passed without using drugs. That's the sort of general rule. But again, do have them discuss that with their own healthcare provider. Somebody asked, when you're taking temperatures and there's a line, what do you do if someone has a high temperature? You have that person step aside. Won't it be obvious to those in line that they had a temperature? Yes, and it's a good question, and there's only so much we can do. And actually, that's a great segue to this slide. So if an employee is diagnosed, do we tell everyone else? So you do need to notify other employees that they've been exposed in the workplace, but you should not reveal who is sick. That said, if you're in a small workplace, they're probably going to figure it out, right? So if you've only got 15 employees and only one of them is out sick, and you send out a letter saying, hey, you all have potentially been exposed to COVID-19 in the workplace, they're going to figure out that Marla, the one who's out sick, is the person with COVID-19. It's not your job to lock the secret down perfectly. It's just your job not to share it yourself. So if you've got a line of employees having their temperatures taken, yeah, you're just going to have to ask that person to, step aside, remove themselves from the building. You haven't shared the exact number. You could have asked them to step aside for some other reason, like to discuss how you overpaid them, or that you don't like the socks they're wearing that day. So yeah, a little information may get out there. Other employees may figure out what's going on, as long as we aren't, directly sharing it, or being lazy about it. Then we've done our job. What about employees who are out sick and we're not sure why? Can we ask about their symptoms? Yes, absolutely. And you should. And if they tell you that, they probably have COVID-19 and they were in fact in the workplace recently, then you should be sending out that letter that says, you've had some potential exposure. It doesn't mean you need to close the workplace for 14 days or send everyone home for 14 days. It does mean that people should be monitoring their own symptoms and taking their own temperature, and you should do some extra cleaning, which is actually described in that CDC interim guidance document that I referenced on the very first slide. What about an employee who's got someone sick at home? What do we do about them? They should not be in the office. The CDC says if you're living with someone who has COVID-19 or is presumed to have COVID-19, that you need to self-quarantine for 14 days. So yeah, you should not be allowing that person into the office. What about employees who are just afraid to come in? Can we make them? Can we enforce our attendance policies? And yes, you can. If there's no legitimate threat and they don't require an accommodation. So I think one of you asked, so you said, can we ask a non-essential employee who's over 60 and staying home for underlying health conditions to return to work? No, you definitely wouldn't want to do that. They're not essential. They're in a high-risk group and they have underlying health conditions. No, absolutely do not ask that person to return to work. Until we've been told that the risk is low and, oh, we're reopening the economies and all the rest. No, someone who is high risk is going to be entitled to a reasonable accommodation. That kicks in under the ADA if you have 15 or more employees. Many states have something similar to that kicks in at a lower number of employees. And even if there wasn't a reasonable accommodation law, we want to be good humans and we don't want to endanger the lives of our employees. So if people need to stay home because they're high risk, they should be allowed to do so. If their doctor has told them to stay home because they're high risk, then they will be entitled to FFCRA leave, which we will talk about in depth later. That's not never ending though, that's just 80 hours worth if they're full-time. All right, so hopefully we have sent a lot of people home. In that case, we may be thinking about work from home policies and what those should look like if this is something we haven't necessarily done before. So a policy should cover hours of work. That seems kind of obvious. But if you want them to work their regular hours of 8 to 5, make that clear. Employees might think, well, as long as I get my 8 hours in, it doesn't matter when I do it. And you might have a very different opinion of that. You'll also want to cover reachability. So do you expect them to be on Slack or on Skype or on Google Hangouts? Do you need them to be there all day long? Do you want them to just respond to everything within 15 minutes? Just make it clear what you want from them there. Additionally, with check-ins, if you want them checking in with their supervisor or with their subordinates on a certain schedule, make that clear as well. And check-ins are a good idea, even if, we sort of just trust our employees to get their stuff done. Check-ins just kind of keep us all connected and feeling a little bit like we do have a real workplace. So I encourage them, maybe more than necessary, just to keep people connected. And then office expenses are really important to cover. You might be willing to cover lots of things. You might be willing to cover nothing. Whatever the case is, let employees know before they go home and start spending their own money on an office, because they might think you're going to reimburse them for that, same ergonomic chair that they have in the workplace. And, that's a $1,000 chair. You don't want to be covering that expense. So just get clear ahead of time what kind of things will be covered. Here are some working from home tips. You can use these yourself. If you're sending people home, you may want to pass these tips on. I'm not suggesting that you make rules out of these. These are just sort of best practices and how to help us all make working from home more successful. So if at all humanly possible, create a space for yourself where you will do your work. So that might be the kitchen counter. You might not have any other location, but make a place that is sort of your designated working spot. Do try to maintain some normalcy with hours. I know that for myself, that has kind of gone out the window, but we are also incredibly busy right now answering COVID-19 questions all day, every day. Assuming things have not ramped up wildly for you, do try to give yourself a morning and an evening that do not include work. I'd encourage you to get dressed. I'll have you all know that I am like wearing shoes and a sweater. I did not come to this presentation in my robe, even though I am working from home. And that will just help you and your employees sort of get in the right headspace. Remember to drink water. Remember to take breaks. These are things that we very easily forget to do at home for whatever reason, probably because there's nobody to talk to in the lunchroom, which is the kitchen. So we're just not compelled to get up. And I sort of mentioned this with check-ins, but communicate for fun. Reach out to people just because, even if you don't necessarily need something from them. Go for the harmless office gossip, or checking in on their kids and their dogs and all the rest. And if you're a manager, talk to your direct reports at least once a day, just to acknowledge them and let them know that you haven't forgotten about them. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Josh for a few minutes here. We're going to run a couple of polls.
Okay, thank you, Kara. Really quick, we are going to do 2 polls. I'm going to share this information with you. I'm going to launch the first one right now. The question is, what actions have you already taken in response to COVID-19? This is multi-select, so if you've done more than one of these, you can choose as many as you need to. Options: reducing hours, laying off employees, furloughed employees, applying for financial assistance, SBA loan, closed or closing your business entirely, recalling employees. We are starting to see early signs of employers looking for help and guidance on recalls, sending employees home to work from home, which has obviously been very, very common. I'll give you a minute to do that. While you're answering that, I'll remind you we are going to be sending the slides and the recording to you in about 24 hours by email, so keep an eye out for that. I know a few of you have asked on that. And then I've also noticed several people have submitted questions in the chat. if you could submit questions to the Q&A box. I know it can be confusing, but there is a Q&A box. It's much more visible for Karen. I know she likes to keep an eye on that as she's presenting and try to address certain questions as they come in. We do have a very large audience today, so we'll do our best. Okay, it looks like we are at 70% voted. I'm going to close this out and share the results there. Okay, looks like no surprise there. Sending employees to work from home is the #1, followed by applying for financial assistance or the SBA loan, reducing hours for employees, layoffs. You can see there. Looks like 5% are in the recalled employees bucket, which is I think a good sign, possibly. So I'll stop sharing that. We're going to do one more poll here. Let me select #2. This one has to do with what topics related to COVID are you interested in learning more about? So again, multi-select if there's more than one here that you would like to learn about. But the question is, what COVID-19 related topics are you most interested in learning more about? Managing work from home employees, supporting corporate culture with a remote workforce, compliance considerations around layoffs, furloughs, and recalls, handbook and policy management with a remote workforce, workplace health and safety standards after COVID. So once we do get back to work, what's the new norm for health and safety in the workplace? And then continued guidance on the legislation. So we are at 50%. I'm going to give it 5 more seconds. Thank you so much. This is a great response rate here. So we're at 65, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close this out. So just so you can see what your peers are interested in, I'll share these results. It looks like the winner, and this has been consistent. So the guidance on the legislation, you're in the right place. I think the rest of the webinar is basically going to cover that. And then #2, workplace health and safety standards after COVID, compliance considerations around furloughs, layoffs, and recalls. So we hope that's just a little bit of insight to see what your peers are facing as well. So I will stop sharing that, and I believe we are ready to hop into the last part of the webinar, which is the legislative stuff, the FFCRA. So Kara, back to you.
All right. Yeah, so we have a fat section on the FFCRA now. The next 12 or 13 slides have a lot of words on them. I promise not to read them all to you, but we have been getting a lot of guidance from the DOL and the IRS, which is great. And so I've included a lot of it here. You will get a copy of this presentation, both like the video, the whole thing, as well as the deck. So you can review this later if you're finding this to be a helpful resource. Do remember though that this is like as of today accurate, and both CDC guidance is changing, and I expect that we'll see some DOL and IRS guidance may change in the future as well. So do keep up with us on the HR Support Center. We're keeping things up to date there as well, and that will be more up to the minute than this deck will be, at least a week from now. All right, I'm going to talk about emergency paid sick leave, which I'm going to call EPSL, and emergency FMLA, EFMLA. I'm going to talk about the details of those first. Then I'm going to get into the exceptions and exemptions, and I know a lot of the questions are about that. I'll also be talking about documentation that you can require. So now's the time to perk up your ears if you are interested in the legislation, because I'm going to cover a lot. All right, so first of all, emergency paid sick leave. Who does this cover? It covers all private employers with fewer than 500 employees. Yes, that means you, even if you only have 12 employees, or 3 employees, or 499. This law is for you. It applies to all employees, no matter how long they've been employed. So if you hire someone tomorrow and they need sick leave 2 weeks from now, they are entitled to this sick leave. We can exempt healthcare providers and emergency responders, but I want to be clear that just because you are a healthcare facility does not mean that you are exempt from the law in its entirety. It just means that you could exempt certain workers. How does this interact with other paid time off benefits? This is in addition to anything else you offer. So if you already offer 2 weeks of paid time off that can be used for anything during the year, this is on top of that. You cannot reduce your benefit because this has come out. What can this be used for? Well, it's really key that this can be used when an employee is unable to work because of one of these things. This can't be used if an employee is unable to work because you don't have any work for them to do. So if you have already furloughed someone, meaning, you've sent them home for a couple of weeks because business is so slow, and they want to claim emergency paid sick leave, but they don't have any hours scheduled, they aren't eligible. They're unable to work because you don't have work for them. They're not unable to work because of their illness. So first of all, the employee has to be working. You have to have stuff for them to do. So if that is the case, and then one of these other things applies, they get EPSL. So number one is that the individual employee is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order. This is generally not a shelter-in-place, a stay-at-home, or a hunker-down order, except in very limited circumstances, which I'll address later. This mostly means, an individual employee has been told by, let's say, the CDC, while they stepped off their cruise ship, that they were going to go live in that hotel down the street for the next 14 days. So this is about an individual employee being told, hey, you're a danger, go quarantine or isolate by like a local health authority, the CDC, the state, whatever. This can also apply if they're advised by their own healthcare provider to self-quarantine because the provider believes that the employee may have COVID-19 or is particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. So either they have it for sure because they got a test, they probably have it because they have symptoms, or they're high risk and them getting it would be really bad and they'd be more likely to die. So if they've been told by a healthcare provider to stay home for one of those reasons, then they're covered by EPSL. They can also take it when they are seeking diagnosis. So this might only take, half an hour if they're making a phone call, or it might take all day, depending on, if the phones are busy or if they actually have to physically go into a clinic because for whatever reason they can't figure out how to get a telehealth appointment. The fourth reason we can use EPSL is if our employee needs to take care of someone who is subject to a government order or a healthcare provider's suggestion that they self-quarantine or isolate. This person needs to require care. So let's say you've got an employee who has a grandma who has been told to quarantine because she had some potential exposure on her last, international cruise. Well, if grandma can take care of herself, like the cruising grandma she is, then your employee does not need to take time off to care for her. She does not require that care. However, let's say grandma was not on a cruise. Grandma actually, got COVID-19, from a neighbor and is now at home in really bad shape and requires care. Then the employee can take EPSL to take care of grandma because grandma requires care. EPSL can also be used if a child is out of school because of COVID-19. So if school is out, or daycare is out, or their child care provider is unavailable, then we can use EPSL. One of you asked, what if somebody needs more than 2 weeks? That's a really good question. The benefit that they can get is at most 80 hours. Beyond that, if they still need to be out, I would encourage you to provide unpaid leave or let them work from home if that's a viable option. But basically, you're not required to pay them more than the 80 hours. And that 80 hours is getting reimbursed by the government. You're taking it off the top of your payroll tax bill. Beyond that, you don't have to offer a new benefit. And there isn't job protection beyond that in any meaningful way either. So again, if somebody needs more time than that, let's say they're high risk, you know, and so they're going to get paid for the first 2 weeks, and after that, it's going to be unpaid. I would encourage you to provide an accommodation. If you're 15 or greater, you're definitely required to provide an accommodation of letting them take an unpaid leave. The ADA would require that, but it wouldn't have to be paid. So full-time employees, they get 80 hours. Even if they work more than 40 hours a week, 80 is the max. Part-time employees will get the number of hours they usually work over a 2-week period. If they have extremely random hours, you can do a 6-month look back and see what their average over 6 months was. This can be taken intermittently for childcare purposes if the employer agrees to it. So the employer doesn't have to allow intermittent leave if they don't want to. They can just deny it outright, but it can be taken intermittently, and I would encourage employers to allow it to be taken intermittently. I think in a lot of cases, you know, the parents are going to trade off, even if they're both working from home. If they've got a kid or 3, you know, somebody is going to have to be watching at least the little ones during part of the day. So in many cases, I think, you know, one parent will take 2 days and the other will take 3, and there will be some trading off. It can be taken intermittently or in 2 or 3 blocks of time for illness only if teleworking or if there are like different rounds of illness. So let's say grandma in our scenario needed help for a week, and then some other family member took over. So your employee took a week of EPSL to take care of grandma. 3 months down the road, let's say they get sick themselves or grandpa needs help, they can take that other week of EPSL. They can't just keep taking it though. It's 80 hours total starting April 1st through December 30th, 2020. That's the maximum length of the law, and you only get up to 80 hours during that time. If they're taking it for their own illness or their own quarantine, we can't have them bopping in and out of the office. So that's why it says only if teleworking. But if you do have an employee who, let's say, has COVID-19, and, you know, some days they feel okay and some days they don't, or, you know, they feel like they can work half a day but not a full day, then we can do intermittent for illness because they're working from home. And somebody said, well, this person's actually asking about EFMLA, but it applies to emergency paid sick leave too. The question is, can leave be used for like 3 hours a day for an employee who's working from home and so is their spouse? This is incredibly common. You know, the kid's going to school online, they need help with their homework. Yeah, this can be taken in very small increments if you're okay with that. The DOL even gave an example of 90 minutes at a time. So yeah, you can break this down really, really small. There's a cap of $511 per day or 100% of regular pay for the first 3 uses. So you can back up and look at 1, 2, 3 when you've got this slide deck. That's when you're taking care of yourself. There's a cap of $200 per day or 2/3 of regular pay if you're taking care of someone else, including your own kid. So if you're taking care of grandma or taking care of your kid, then it's only $200 or 2/3 per day. I think I skipped right past reason number 6 on that last slide. Let me back up for just a second. So number 6 is that someone is experiencing a substantially similar condition as defined by the Secretary of HHS. I skipped it because that doesn't really exist yet. We haven't received a definition from the Secretary, at least not last I checked. So that's not a real thing yet. So basically, number 6 is pointless, and don't worry about it. If we do get a definition of number 6, I'm sure we will be sending an email and putting it on the HR Support Center as big news, because that will be very interesting to all of us. All right, let's talk about EFMLA now. So EPSL, if somebody is sick or self-quarantining or isn't coming out of their house for months at a time because they're high risk, that only lasts 2 weeks. And then we start looking at unpaid options. If someone needs to care for a child, they can use EPSL for the first 2 weeks and then EFMLA after that. So once again, this applies to all employers with fewer than 500 employees. It applies to all employees who have worked at least 30 days for the employer. So not 0 days like sick leave, but 30 days. And once again, we can exclude healthcare providers or emergency responders. And I will get to those definitions a few slides down the road. This can be used when an employee is unable to work or telework, same definition, because they will be the only caregiver for a child under 15, unless special circumstances apply. So again, you have work available for them. If you're furloughed, they can't ask for EFMLA, right? If nobody's working or you don't have a job for them to do, they don't get EFMLA. This is only if you have something for them to do. If they can't do it because they need to care for a kid or kids, then we're looking at EFMLA. If they can telework, they're not entitled to EFMLA. However, a lot of people can sort of, like someone chatted in about, they can telework part of the day, but then part of the day they're going to have to watch the kids. So that's fine. We're going to be looking at an intermittent situation there. The rule with kids 15 and older is sort of dictated by the IRS. So we're going to assume that anybody 14 or younger does need some kind of supervision. We're assuming kids 15 and older really don't. So if an employee is saying, I need to watch my kid who's 17 or my kid who's 37, they need to certify that there are special circumstances. They don't have to explain them to you. They don't have to prove it, but they have to basically promise that there's, something special going on that requires that older child to have care. So EFMLA goes for up to 12 weeks, just like regular FMLA. If you are an employer that is subject to regular FMLA, this is not on top of that. It's not an extra 12 weeks. It just gets thrown into the mix with that 12 weeks per 12-month period. The first 10 days are unpaid, but employees may use any other leave they have available during that first 10 days, or you can require them to use other leave during that 10 days, just like regular FMLA. So if somebody's on FMLA, which is usually an unpaid leave, the employer can require them to use up other benefits. However, you can't require them to use up sick leave unless it's EPSL. So if they have a sick leave bank with you, you can't require them to use that up during EFMLA because they're not sick. They can use that EPSL, though, that 80 hours, if they haven't used it up for something else already. So they can't take, like we said, they can't take EPSL twice. After that 10 days, they're going to get $200 per day, or 2/3 of their regular pay, whichever is smaller. If after those first 10 days, if you want to make them fill in the gap, that last third of their income with a PTO bank or vacation days or whatever they've got with you, you can do that. So if you want them to, run down their vacation bank with you, you can require that they fill in the gap. You don't have to require that. You can certainly make it optional. I suspect a lot of employees will want to do that if they have vacation time or PTO to fill in with, just because, their bills are probably based on their regular income. So I'd encourage you to allow that. You can require it if you want to. All right, now we have come to appropriate documentation to claim the tax credit. So what do you need from employees and what can you ask for from employees? Well, you can't ask for much. You can't ask for a doctor's note. I know this completely baffles employers, but the government does not want you sending people to the doctor for a note right now. And there will almost certainly be abuse of this system, but we're okay with that. We figure some abuse of the system is better than, you know, people coming to work sick. So that's really the bottom line here. So what you do need to get to sort of prove to the IRS that you weren't just giving everybody free vacation is the following. You need the employee's name, you need the dates they want leave, you need a statement of the reason they're asking for leave, so which of those 6 reasons, and a statement that they're unable to work because of that reason, including teleworking. Then, depending on the reason they want leave, you'll probably need a little extra. Most of them require a little extra. So for a quarantine order or self-quarantine advice, the statement should include the name of the government entity or ordering quarantine, or the name of the healthcare provider that's advising quarantine. So when an employee fills out the form, they're going to tell you that it was Dr. Morales that told them to self-quarantine because they are high risk. They don't actually have to tell you it's because they were high risk, I suppose, but they're going to tell you that Dr. Morales told them to self-quarantine. You are not allowed to ask for more than that. If they're caring for someone, like the employee who's taking care of grandma, we want grandma's name. We want the relationship, so we want to know that that's grandma. And we also want to know the name of grandma's doctor who told her that she should stay in the house. If the school is closed or child care provider is unavailable, then we want the name of the kids, we want the ages of the kids, and we want the name of the school or place of care that is closed. Once again, this could be grandma. This could be, you know, Darlene Clemmer is unavailable to watch my children. She usually watches my children. We also want a representation that no other person will be providing care during that time. So no, both mom and dad can't take FFCRA leave or EFMLA at the same time and both get their money and just like hang out at home with the kid. So it's one or the other. The IRS is assuming it only takes one parent to watch the kids. All right, one of you chatted in some confusion, which is totally understandable, about that number one reason, and as you can see, I know it's confusing, so we've got a whole slide about it. So that number one reason where it says somebody can use it for a federal, state, or local quarantine order, that generally doesn't apply to shelter in place, because usually the shelter in place order has caused the business to close. So again, we'll always circle back to, do you have work available for that person? If your business is open right now and you have work available for that person to do, and the only reason they can't do it is because of a shelter in place order, then they could qualify for EPSL. So one example of this would let's say we have an essential business. It's a local hardware store. They are allowed to be opened right now. And one of their cashiers is a gentleman in his 70s. And we are in a state that has been very specific that senior citizens 65 and older need to stay home, like period, end of story, shall stay home, do not go out. You know, we're not saying small groups. We're saying, no, stay in your house, don't open the front door to senior citizens. Then that individual would be able to collect EPSL just for 2 weeks because they are subject personally to a quarantine order that is preventing them from doing work that you, the employer, currently have available for them. So just if you know, a stay-at-home order has caused your business to be really slow or has caused you to close down, that doesn't apply because it's not the reason they're unable to work. They're unable to work because you don't have hours for them. They have to be unable to work when work is available because of a really specific stay-at-home order. This was completely baffling. It took like 3 attorneys and an HR person. We sat down for like an hour to try to hash out what exactly that meant and what narrow scenarios we could provide where it would actually kick in, and there just aren't many. So in most cases, number one is not going to apply to stay-at-home orders, but there is this sort of very narrow situation where it does. One of the biggest questions we're getting is about the exemption for small employers. And unfortunately, a lot of small employers are sort of used to being exempt from things. So early on, they heard, oh, there's an exemption for small employers. And they kind of just assumed it was going to be really broad and that all they had to do was say, I'm small. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It's actually a relatively narrow exemption. It's for employers with fewer than 50 employees, and it's only if one of these three things is true. It's not a burden or an undue burden. It's a very high bar. So let's look at bullet number one. Providing leave would result in the small business's expenses and financial obligations exceeding available business revenues and cause it to cease operating at a minimal capacity. So this doesn't mean you're operating at 80% or even 50%. It means basically you can't operate at all if you provide childcare leave. You're not going to know that until people start requesting it. And you get paid back for this, right? So you take it right off the top of your payroll tax bill. Presumably, you're saving money to pay payroll taxes in an account. So basically, you can just go raid that account to pay out these leaves, because when you get your payroll tax bill, you're just going to take the amount you paid for leaves right off the top of that bill. So it's pretty unlikely that, one or two people asking for intermittent child care leave is going to put you out of business. So please don't assume that this is a big blanket exemption that small employers can just like grab onto and say, oh, I'm exempt from the law. You're not exempt from the law. You can also exempt someone if they are so necessary for you as a business that if they left, you'd be totally hosed. So let's say you've got one person who does all your HR and all your payroll. Maybe that's you, the person listening to this presentation right now. And if they were to leave you, the checks wouldn't get cut, people wouldn't get their FFCRA leave, things would just fall apart all around us. In that case, we could deny that person child care leave. Once again, this is only for small businesses. However, really big however on this one. The government does not endorse free-range children. 3-year-olds cannot take care of themselves. So if you are considering telling this person that they can't have leave to take care of their kid, and there's no one else who can take care of their kid, they'll probably quit. And they will almost certainly qualify for unemployment insurance under the new expanded rules. So if they have to choose between caring for a child that literally can't care for or feed itself versus, keeping their job, they're going to take care of the kid. So I would strongly encourage that you to not just deny leave, but to work out some kind of intermittent schedule, negotiate with this person. Hopefully having them part-time is better than having them not at all. You could also deny leave as a small employer if you just simply don't have enough people to get the work done. So let's say you make something that you sell on Etsy. You've got 2 people who are your makers. One of them makes the first half of the product. The second person finishes the product. And if either of those people were to go on leave, you would have no product. Nobody would be there to make the thing that you make. In that case, you could deny leave. Once again, if that person is sort of in a situation where they have to choose between, caring for small children versus keeping their job, chances are they're going to care for the small children because little kids don't feed themselves. So be flexible if you can. Don't just go wild with this exemption because I think it'll backfire. All right, my next somebody chatted in, is this true even if the employee is sick? So no. Let me return to the headline here. This is only an exemption from the child care leaves. There is no exemption from offering sick leave. It doesn't matter how small you are. It doesn't matter how broke you are. If somebody asks for sick leave because they're sick or because they need to care for someone who's sick or quarantined, they get the leave, like full stop, end of story. This exemption is only available with respect to child care leave. All right, let's look at the exemptions for healthcare workers and emergency responders. When I say look at, I mean you can read these later if you want. They're really broad. They're really, really broad. What I want you to take away is the part in bold at the bottom. And the DOL says that to minimize the spread of the virus, they really want employers to be judicious when using these exemptions. So almost everybody under the sun that has any affiliation with a healthcare provider could be exempted, meaning the employer could decide to deny them leave and say, no, you have to come to work anyway. The DOL doesn't really want you to do that. They don't want you to go overboard with it, certainly. If someone is saying, I'm sick, or I think I'm sick, or I'm taking care of someone who's sick, if you can spare them, please do. It's not that they're being denied the leave by the IRS. It's just we're saying that we know that, you know, healthcare providers are really slammed right now and you need the option of keeping people at work. So you have the option, but you don't have to take it. And again, this leave gets paid for by the government. So if you can spare that person while they need to take leave, you are encouraged to do so. How does this leave get paid for? Well, I've said a time or two already. Basically, when you get your payroll tax bill that you usually pay, you just get to take right off the top any amount you spent on these leaves, 100%. If you spent more, you will get a refund. If you can't afford to pay it right now because you just haven't saved up enough, and you know you've got too many people asking for leave at once relative to you know how much you've saved for payroll taxes, you can apply for an advance using IRS Form 7200. So here are some links and some Google phrases that will get you good top hits. The DOL questions and answers covers a ton of stuff. It's where, you know, most of this material has come from. There are 79 Q&As right now. So if you have a question I didn't answer, I would strongly encourage you to go there. It gets way more into intermittent leave and various definitions and all the rest. So check that out. And you can word search the page. If you hit Control F on your keyboard, it'll pop a little thing up and you can type in the word you're looking for and it'll take you to those results. So that might be helpful if you're looking for something in particular. Also, the IRS has pretty darn good guidance on how to utilize the payroll tax credit. If you Google IRS, FFPRA, FAQ, the top hit will be their FAQ page. All right, let's talk pretty quickly about reducing hours or closing. So if you need to reduce employees' hours, you certainly can. Do remember that if you send people home partway through the day, you might owe reporting time pay if you're in one of about a dozen states, including California and New York. So if things have just gotten really slow and you weren't sure if you'd need everybody and you end up sending somebody home after just 15 minutes, you might owe reporting time pay. We have information on that in the HR Support Center for every single state. You can also reduce pay. I know some employers are doing like across the board pay cuts. I was part of one of those back in 2008. Good times. So that's something you can certainly do. Do remember that employees need to stay above the minimum wage though, whether it's federal or state or local. They can't waive their right to minimum wage or overtime. Don't let anybody try to talk you into that. Even if they sign in blood, they will have a wage and hour claim against you when they change their mind about it later. How about exempt employees or managers who are paid on a salary basis? We can cut their pay as well. but we do need to keep it above the federal or state minimum salary. It's kind of like a minimum wage, except for exempt people. So the federal minimum is $684 a week right now, and a couple of states have higher ones. So California and New York are in the $1,000 range, and that number can't be prorated. So if you have an exempt employee working 40 hours a week, making $1,000 a week, you can't cut them to 20 hours a week and $500 a week and keep them as exempt because that's below that minimum and we can't prorate. What you can do instead is reclassify them as non-exempt. So this is going to be legal unless we're like flip-flopping back and forth. If we're doing it just to evade paying someone on a salary basis, or you know, taking improper deductions, it's not going to fly. But I think most employers doing it right now are doing it sort of for the foreseeable future. Do remember that those folks will now be non-exempt and will be entitled to non-exempt benefits like overtime and breaks. So even if they're working from home, they will be entitled to, you know, paid breaks if your state requires that, and most states require some kind of break. If you have furloughed employees, they will be eligible for unemployment insurance. So you don't have to fire someone or terminate them fully for them to get UI, which is good news. You can just keep them on the payroll and tell them you'll have them back in a few weeks. Requirements have been relaxed and waiting weeks have been waived. As I mentioned a couple of times, employees can now get unemployment insurance even if they leave employment due to a risk of exposure or infection. So even if they leave of their own accord, they can get unemployment insurance. Will they get it just for a generalized fear? No. But if, for instance, they are, you know, an essential employee, but they have risk factors and they're a senior citizen as well, I suspect they are going to get UI under those circumstances. We'd rather give them unemployment insurance than have them basically end up in the healthcare system or dead. You will want to figure out benefits for employees. In many cases, they're going to lose eligibility if you reduce their hours significantly or, you know, furlough them entirely. So figure out if you need to give them a COBRA notice, a mini COBRA notice, or, you know, point them toward the state marketplace, whatever the case may be. If you can't make payroll, this is the one time in the presentation, I will say that you should call an attorney. There are just really too many factors to determine, you know, what the best path is without talking to a lawyer. So if that's the case, do call a lawyer. There is a glimmer of hope in all of this that most of you have probably already looked into. The CARES Act created a number of options for employers to get grants and loans and defer other payroll taxes, et cetera. We don't consult on this, it's out of our scope, but hopefully you've got a tax person or a CPA or somebody who's really good with the money stuff who can help you figure some of this out. So I would encourage you to look at those resources. We do have lots and lots of questions and just a couple minutes left, so I figured I would pick a couple more of those off. Somebody asked, if we reduce an employee's hours, can they get unemployment for that? Most of the time, yes. It depends on state law, but I think most states do provide partial unemployment insurance. If you reduce their hours by like 1 per week, they probably won't qualify. But if they're reduced in any significant way, they will probably qualify for some unemployment insurance. Somebody asked, can we reduce PTO at this time? If you want to reduce accrual going forward, you can give notice of that and do so. You can't just say, hey, this hit us really hard, we're taking PTO out of everybody's bank. That would be a very bad idea. And in some states, that would be super illegal. Some states consider PTO to be vested wages. So if you were to reduce someone's PTO bank, that would be wage theft, just out of hand. You don't want to be reducing PTO that has already been earned. Somebody asked, can you reduce hours for exempt employees? Yes, you can, but since exempt employees are not paid by the hour, just reducing their hours doesn't do you any good. Exempt employees are paid on a salary basis, so reducing their hours shouldn't affect their salary. You'd also need to implement a salary reduction, and I talked about the rules for that, which you can look back at again when the slide deck comes out to you. Someone asked, can we deny employee vacation time if they've said they're going to visit family in another state? It's not an emergency. There's a stay-at-home order where we are from our governor, and we're an essential business that has stayed open. Yeah, you can deny PTO. You can deny PTO at any time. You'd want to do so in line with your policies, and you'd want to do so in a non-discriminatory fashion. But employers always have the option of saying, no, now is not a good time for you to take PTO. Somebody asked, if someone's unemployed due to performance issues, will they get the extended coverage due to COVID? That's a good question. I don't actually have the answer. Yeah, that's a really good question. My guess is yes, because I feel like the government, the various state governments probably don't have time to follow up under the circumstances on why people were terminated. Additionally, people who are terminated right now are going to have a really hard time finding new work. So my guess is that yeah, they're getting the extended coverage and the extra benefits, even if they weren't terminated due to COVID, but I can't guarantee it. Trying to figure out all the unemployment insurance stuff is a little outside of our scope. And since it's all very state specific, we try not to dig in on that, but that's a good question. And somebody asked, will an employee receive the additional $600 a week benefit if they're collecting partial unemployment for reduced hours? And what I read on some government site a week or 3 ago was the yes. If they're eligible for any amount of unemployment insurance, they would get that extra $600 a week, which is fascinating to me. But I'm assuming that the government's like, please get money out into the economy. The economy to survive really needs people to spend money on things like, food and rent and whatnot. So just getting money circulating, I think, is really part of the goal there. All right, I am now over time by a couple minutes. Thank you all for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. Once again, we will send you a copy of the entire presentation as well as the slide deck.
Thank you, Kara. And Kara, just a quick question. I know there's a question here about CE credits, and I know you have some experience there. So these are not pre-approved due to the cadence of this topic. It's very fluid, and we're not, some of the pre-approvals take upwards of 45 days to get. But your experience in self-submitting, can you explain that to the audience? We have a couple people asking about that. Yeah, so if you are a member, like if you've got a SHRM accreditation or HRCI, you can absolutely self-submit for this, and it does, as far as we're concerned, meet all the requirements. Our audiences are just too large for us to keep track of whether you were here for the whole hour, which is technically a requirement for us. We have to prove that you paid attention, and we can't do that with that many people here. But yeah, you can absolutely self-submit this. It's not hard to do. That's how actually I get most of my credits through HRCI is self-submitting things. So by all means, keep the deck when it comes to you, and you should be able to get credit for this. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We took in, it looks like upwards of 400 questions, so we hope we got around to as many as possible. And so thank you for your participation there. Keep an eye out for more webinars coming in the future, and we hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.